Very warm welcome indeed to CogX 2023. Welcome. It is brilliant to be back, our 7th edition of this festival. Thank you for being here. Thanks for tuning in online or catching up around the world. And thank you especially for being here at the O2 in Greenwich. It's so good to see you in person. These sessions are a bit more intimate. I'm Oli Barrett, the sort of host for these Q&A sessions over 3 days. And really, I get the honor of introducing our speakers, but it's really on you here in person to fire us all up with your questions. And by the way, anything said on mic by me or by you will be broadcast, so please bear that in mind. It's not an off-record session. And I'll say feel free to introduce yourselves when you ask questions, but you don't have to. So that's the idea. So onwards. Our next speaker and our next special guest will be known to many of you already. He's the co-founder and the executive director of the Center for Humane Technology. So, of course, Tristan will be known to many of you as someone who advises literally world leaders around the world, including flying in for a very special summit tomorrow in Washington, which we'll hear more about. Childhood partly as a magician, certainly working at Google as a design ethicist, and also time with Stanford's Persuasive Technology Lab, probably best known to many of our guests tuning in as a star of the Netflix hit, The Social Dilemma. Without further ado, let's give a CogX welcome to Tristan Harris. Thank you, Tristan. Let's just get this out of the way. One thing that does get said about you, the closest thing Silicon Valley has to a conscience. That's a high bar when you're on your worst behavior.
Correct. Yeah. I'm just a human being who cares about how does this go well. And it's nice when you get monikers like that, but it's a standard that's hard to live up to.
Yeah, and you are amazing holding people to account. Tell us what you're flying into Washington for tomorrow.
Yeah, so tomorrow, how many people here know about this, the Schumer Insight Forum? Okay, just a couple. So this is actually something that's never happened before, which is that the US government is self-aware that the speed at which they're operating around AI and just hosting lots of congressional hearings will not get us to where we need to go. And so they're doing something they've never done before, which is they're hosting an Insight Forum. And the format is, I just found out about this like the last couple days, so you're finding out information that will be public in a couple days. People who are invited, the CEOs of all the AI companies. So it's going to be Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Sam Altman, Eric Schmidt, everybody.
Invited and attending.
Invited and attending. So in person, flying in with their private jets, in a U-shaped sort of discussion forum. Surrounding them will be 100 senators who are not videotaped grandstanding, trying to ask a provocative question for a 3-minute social media clip to go viral, but actually sitting and listening to the CEOs talking to about 8 civil society groups, of which I am one.
Amazing. So giving a pep talk to the contributors, how do you make this a change moment, not just another thing?
That's right.
What do you say to them?
How
do you get the very most from it?
That's what I'm thinking about right now, and I've got a long plane flight ahead of me today to think about it. No, honestly, I've met with very high up leaders and very high up meetings and on these topics. I think this is probably going to be the most consequential because it's the opportunity to coordinate the race. Because in our diagnosis, the key issue with AI, it's not that there's these different harms that are like a cacophony of grievances and issues. It's that the arms race to deploy capabilities as fast as possible means that you go at you're releasing, synthetic media, voice cloning, protein folding. Like your job, the way you win the race and the way you attract the best talent is showing you have the coolest stuff and you just release it as fast as possible. And that is done by good people with good intentions. And even there was a case where like certain companies had held back certain capabilities, let's say around voice cloning, but they're like, well, the other companies all started releasing it, so now what are we going to do? Well, we already have that technology. We spent billions of dollars on it. Our shareholders put the money into it. If we don't release it, so that's the race that we diagnose as the core issue. And it's a race between the companies, and it's a race between different nations. And what we need is something, I think the nuclear issue is a similar one, but it's different in the fact that AI is omni-use and has benefits. AI was, nuclear weapons was a weapon that had destructive capability, but AI is GDP growth, scientific discovery, cures for cancer, climate change solutions, at the same time that it poses risks that basically destabilize society. And so I think but the thing that has to happen is how do we coordinate the race? So my goal in the meeting tomorrow is how do we establish a consensus about the destabilization risks that come from the stuff that's being released right now.
That is the challenge.
And come up with shared norms.
Right, got it. Now let's pause briefly. I think let's get straight into your questions. Who's got a question for Tristan? Raise your hand. I see there, I see there, I see there as well. Other hands, I'm looking for other hands. Why don't we just come, I will honor all of those, but let's come down the front first, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much. Sorry, making you race around, keeping warm, and then we'll go straight back over here. Please, feel free to say who you are. Off you go.
Hello, Tristan. I'm Maria from PwC. Love your speech, a big fan. There was a call of action at the end. You said, all of us in the room, you have to join this revolution. And obviously, there's a lot of focus now on tech sector participating in all those conversations, so much so that to date, to the AI Safety Summit in the UK, very few companies actually receive invites, and I'm unsure if the civil society have received an invite. Mm-hmm. So if there's a call to action to all of us, how companies who are not tech companies, but they still produce a lot of AI, they still use the AI that's being produced by the companies that are going in Washington, should take part in this revolution you've described?
So you're saying, like, how do companies that are not directly the major labs but are using AI participate in standing up for how do we coordinate to a better, safer outcome? It's hard. I need to practice better answers for things like this because obviously there's not always good answers if you're not directly connected to the levers of power. But I do think, if there was a statement, so just like we helped coordinate the 6-month pause letter, right? And the 6-month pause letter, which is, hey, let's pause AI for 6 months. Now, do we think that that was actually going to actually succeed? No. But what did that do? For people who weren't paying attention, it created this massive swing in the Overton window. Do you all know what the Overton window is? It's like basically Samuel Overton in the 1920s basically said, when you do polling, what's in the kind of belief, the art of the possible? Politics is the art of the possible. And you need a public consensus that says that a lot of people think that this is right before you can actually get something passed. And I think that, if companies that are in this sort of second tier maybe, who use AI but don't directly produce the most advanced frontier systems or not directly participating in the race, were to say that we agree that we want to limit open source capabilities, for example. Like we shouldn't just keep releasing Llama 3, Llama 4, et cetera. That would be something that would help. That's one example. The reason for that, by the way, and for those who didn't catch the talk that I just gave, is that open source means something different with generative AI than it meant with past systems. Typically, open source meant if the code is transparent, and therefore everyone's looking at it. So if there's vulnerabilities in it, security issues with it, more people have looked at it, so it's actually more bulletproof and it's safer and more secure. But then there's this weird kind of maneuver that the Meta is using now, which they're hijacking this phrase open source and the positive associations people have with it and smuggling it in to produce this belief that it's going to be safe this time. But when you release an open source AI model, the open weights, the actual model file, which is just the file that they've trained. Facebook spent $35 million training Llama 2. And they did tune it so that it doesn't answer dangerous questions in certain ways. Specifically, if you ask it, how do I make anthrax? It will say, I can't respond to that question. But because when they release it in an open way, anybody can fine-tune that model to say, answer as liberally as you can, bypass all the safety controls. It took an engineer on my team $100 to take the $35 million Llama 2 and train it to become bad Llama, basically answer as freely as you want. Yeah. And it will answer that question uninhibitedly. If maybe the answer that it gives is not perfectly accurate now, but in the future with Llama 3, Llama 4, as it gets more precise, it's going to become dangerous. Yeah. And if we care about that, how do we get the companies? If you had a letter from all these other companies saying, we also agree we need to limit open source past certain
join
capabilities.
Forces, build those coalitions. Let's take this question here, and then we'll go back across.
I'll do shorter answers next time, I apologize.
Hi, my name's Sachin. I build consumer apps. Former history student, which will contextualize my question in a second, which is, you drew upon the example of nuclear weapons as a time where humanity had a choice in regards to some technology, but it was purely destructive. Are there any examples in history where society has had the same point of understanding technology and how to deploy it, and what do they choose at that point, and how did that impact like leaders' decisions, like businesses, I guess capitalism to some extent? Are there any examples of that happening in history outside of weaponry?
Yeah, there's lots of examples. I mean, people say the Montreal Protocol, which was to eliminate CFCs, so CFCs were causing the ozone layer hole, the hole in the ozone, and then we collaborated with the Montreal Protocol to successfully remove that ingredient from refrigerators and these kinds of things to get the ozone hole back. Another example that happened after the fact that I think is more relevant to AI, the problem with AI, as you said, is that different from nukes, which is like purely a destructive technology, purely a weapon, we're escalating on towards a weapon, versus AI is more like what fossil fuels were to physical joules of energy, AI is to cognitive labor. So there's physical labor, it takes like human beings like energy to lift up something and move the atoms in the world, but then you get fossil fuels and you get suddenly free energy. And let's say that we're in 1800 and we're like, oh my God, I see where this is going. If everybody jumps onto fossil fuels, it's going to create global climate change. And I'm saying, let's all not do that, because I'm going to say, I created the fossil fuel dilemma presentation. I give a talk at my local 1800s town hall, and I say, here's this big problem that's about to emerge. But then what happens is those who jump on the fossil fuels train start to outcompete those who say, oh wait, hold on, this is going to cause climate change. So those who don't jump on the train just lose. So the problem is how do we coordinate the race overall? But the example I would give that might be more relevant, I'm thinking about using this tomorrow, is the global financial crisis. What were like credit default swaps and mortgage-backed securities? It's this financial innovation. It's this technology, this financial technology that allows us to get more GDP growth. And everyone who jumps on the train of using this new financial instrument, which was in the financial crisis, that caused the financial crisis, those who jump on that train, they end up starting out competing and making more money than those who don't. So everyone starts jumping on the train. But that leads to this financial crisis, this global breakdown in the financial system. So I think that's actually more relevant because you have these sort of triple C rated risk assets. Imagine that AI is like this super high risk thing, that it gives you GDP growth and productivity and scientific innovation, but literally the CEOs are saying this could wipe out humanity. Imagine if the CEO of Morgan Stanley and Wells Fargo were all saying the same thing. This could wipe out humanity. Please don't use mortgage-backed securities. Please regulate us.
And Tristan, in response to that, there are students, for example, of Gordon Brown, who might argue that it required some global coordination.
Yes.
To stimulate a global response.
Yes.
Who are our white knights that you see, or who ought they to be in this situation to avoid chaos?
I mean, you all are hosting the UK AI Summit coming up in like a month, right?
Bletchley Park in November.
Yep. This is incredibly important. I would ask the question, how can we make that as impactful as possible? I think we have to think, we are living in an unprecedented time in history, and what has to happen is unprecedented. So I want you all to think that this isn't as simple as passing a law or a typical world, right? This is that. I was just with the actor Joseph Gordon-Levitt. We hosted an event with him in DC last week, and he said, this is that point in the movie where we say, like, this impossible thing that has to happen actually has to happen. If you care about your children living in a safe world and you want to have children, you should care about how do we make this next summit. So if you're connected to the apparatus that's hosting that, we need, who are the white knights? I don't know exactly who the white knights are. We need to have the people who understand the race dynamics and say, what would it take to coordinate towards a safer outcome?
Right. Understood. Thank you. Let's take, you've been patient in just there, sir. Here we are, just in the dark shirt, and then 2 doors down, and then we'll go across, and then I'm looking around. We'll be pithy in question and response, sir.
Hello, Kevin Zanderman from the Tony Blair Institute. Interesting to follow up from you mentioning Gordon Brown, but my question is about actually the AI Summit. So as you know, there's a lot of debate about whether to involve China or not. Yeah. I don't think the decision has been taken yet, but I would like to know your stance, because as I'm sure you know, China's been very forceful in regulating generative AI. Yes. Your colleagues at Stanford at DG China have done a lot of great work to make sense of it.
Great question. Why don't we go let's go 2 down, and then we'll juggle both of those. Forgive me, just to the, literally just in front of you, and then I will come back to you before the session.
Sorry, Antonia, how do you do?
Nice to meet you.
It binds into the whole thing. I was going to ask the same, including the white knights question. Stuart Russell said at the opening this morning, there's this idea that governments have that innovation shouldn't be linked to regulation, which makes sense in the context that we're speaking now, and yet at the same time, this whole thing is driven not by governments. And do we really, in an age like today with the polarization and at the same time breakup of structures, still think governments can take us somewhere? And what's your view, and China, so on.
Okay, so
Pass it down
be as
one more.
blunt and pithy as you like, Tristan, on either of those. China first, if we will.
Blunt and pithy. Okay. Sorry for answering.
And that's said by the guy who sees a 5-minute
No, I
clock.
understand. I wish I could be with all of you here longer. So, we need to create high trust relationships with coordination. Coordination depends on trust. The way I see the film The Day After, for those who saw that reference in my talk, was that the Day After scared Reagan and Gorbachev to a degree that, I don't know if you know this, but the film The Day After about nuclear war was aired in both the Soviet Union and the US. It scared both leaders. So now if you're coming to the negotiating table and you're negotiating, the part of me that's negotiating with you is the same, I can see the part of you that also saw the same thing that I saw. So we're both scared about the same thing, which means that there's better faith negotiation. My deep concern with China is that I don't yet know if there's a shared understanding of the degree of risk that's involved here. I think we need to establish that very, very deeply. And the question is, how do you do that in good faith? Well, I will say that what's happening now is there's sort of a track 2 dialogues where the Xi and Biden can't meet on AI. But can the CEOs of major Chinese companies and major US companies, can they meet successfully? And the answer is yes. Can academic institutions from both countries meet? Yes. There are ways you can do track 2 dialogues that I think have been happening and should happen more. I'd like to see more of that happen. I don't have the perfect plan. When it comes to governments and regulation, can you have octogenarians deciding how AI should work and regulating it? Obviously, everyone who's skeptical about the government's ability to get this right, so I'm speaking to the US, where you have 80-year-olds who are designing AI policy. Obviously, that is like a problem. But then the answer, though, is that the companies can't regulate themselves because they have interests that don't allow them to see things clearly. Upton Sinclair said, the famous American writer in the book The Jungle, you can't ask someone to question something that their salary depends on them not seeing. I saw the same thing with social media, where you have really good people who can't fully take in the risks of what they're creating because their business model makes them minimize the risks and downsides of what they're creating. And I think that there is ways of bringing in, folks that I know, people who work on AI safety, into that room and saying, okay, based on the full technical understanding of what AI is and how we would regulate it, how do we craft something that actually meets those technical requirements? Obviously, it's not going to be invented by the 80-year-old who's thinking about the thing.
Yeah, understood. I promise just to go back, row behind. Thank you so much. We're racing your way. And then why don't we take our final pair here, sir and sir. Come.
I can keep it quite pithy, I think. Hi, Tristan. Dominic,
Hi.
loving your work. I was going to ask the same question about what it is that we do, so I'll, excuse the pun, fine-tune it, because I'm in a position where I'm working for a company. I've been a commercial officer for an edtech company who are not embracing this change. They don't see the opportunities or the threats. I know I need to move, right? And so I've seen opportunities in improving ROI using AI in other companies. It's not the end I want to be on. This is kind of, I'd love to end up being a white knight. Specifically, if we aren't in that room with the U-shape, and we aren't able to make people take responsibility for what they're doing, are we designing AI cops that surf the airways, looking for some of these changes? Could we? What should we be doing?
What more can be done? Right, thank you for that.
Yeah.
And just pass across really quickly into our final minutes.
Yeah, so Tim Estes with Angel AI, and I'm a huge fan. I'm working with people in Washington on things like COSA and other things that are related.
Yeah.
Would love to chat a minute after all this, but having said that, related to where you started your presentation, around incentives, and then the point of the financial crisis analogy that came up and you're working on, liability and the exemptions of liability potentially are the great enablers, right, of this
That's
situation. Correct. What strategy do you think has the highest pragmatic probability of achieving a major state change in liability for big tech?
Yeah, great question.
Okay.
Let me take that one first, then I'm sorry, I'll go back to yours. On liability, what's the best way? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but I think I'm hopeful about and I'm wondering about is, as I mentioned on stage, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. How many of the AI companies are based in California? Like in the U.S., at least, most of them. What if Gavin Newsom did something around piercing the corporate veil with the California Insurance Commissioner and saying, hey, you're required to do insurance, and there's some things you can do in California around liability. For those who don't know, the reason that social media was such a messed up thing is that there is this thing called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Communications Decency Act was written in 1996 to regulate the internet, that made platforms immune from anything that was bad that happened, made them not liable. That created this shield that meant that when all of this stuff started going wrong, there was no way to regulate or make them liable for that. But we cannot make that mistake with AI, and there's actually already a bill from Senator Blumenthal and Josh Hawley that basically says Section 230 will not apply to AI companies. That's another thing that could happen. So those are two specific things. With 5 seconds left, what can everybody else do? That's just a bigger conversation. I think that better mitigation strategies, yes, people should be innovating. How can we use AI to better find all the nefarious things that people are going to start to be doing? Because a lot of the capabilities I mentioned in my presentation are already out there. How do we better strengthen and make resilient society to those outcomes? And then how do you coordinate? Like, how can you, people always ask, like, how do you coordinate? Like, I don't know. How am I coordinating? I just started to work on these things. I made a choice, and I started working on it, and we created a nonprofit, and we started inviting people to meetings, and we talked to people one after another, and then 10 years later, we're in this position. So It's not easy to do this, but you can just say, what's my role in standing up? How do I invite people to a screening of the AI dilemma? How do I invite 5 companies? Can I create a letter? Can I organize the other second-tier AI companies to say, we want to limit open source? There's many things you can do.
Yeah. On that, let me encourage all of our guests, have a look at the work of the Center for Humane Technology. That center with the more modern spelling, I notice. That's the first encouragement, the Center for Humane Technology, which Tristan co-founded. Secondly, we say good luck to you tomorrow in DC, and we will read about that in the headlines across the world. So thank you. And finally, not just for your presence here at the CogX Festival, but for your work more broadly in the world, would you all join us in saying a huge thank you to Tristan Harris? Thank you
so much. Thank you.